You've never heard of the vegetable Charlemagne once ordered everyone to plant. In 812 AD, he issued a royal decree. Every imperial farm had to grow lovage, rich in minerals, strong in smell, impossible to kill. Why did Europe's rulers care so much about this one forgotten herb? And how did it vanish without a trace? Let's see why. Good King Henry. In 9th century France, farmers grew a leafy green they didn't need to plant again. They called it Bon Henri, or Good Henry, and it grew quietly along fences, church walls, and garden edges. The English adopted it too, keeping it near kitchens as a hardy spinach replacement. This plant wasn't fancy. It was loyal. Once rooted, it fed families for decades. The leaves were sautéed like spinach, the shoots steamed like asparagus, and the flower buds tossed into soup. Monks in medieval abbeys used it as spring tonic food, especially after long winters. It handled frost, clay, and neglect. By the 1500s, almost every rural garden in northern Europe had it. But then spinach won out commercially. By the 20th century, Good King Henry vanished from seed catalogs. Even botany students missed it. Why did it matter so much for so long? Because one planting gave you 10 to 15 years of greens. That meant less work, more food, and resilience during harsh years. In parts of Wales, it was once baked into barley cakes with lard. Some 19th century herbalists claimed it soothed ulcers and even cleansed the blood. So why did something so tough disappear completely from modern farming? A medieval perennial with deep roots vanished, while a self-planting onion quietly kept marching forward. Egyptian walking onion. It's one of the few vegetables that replants itself, and no one taught it how. The Egyptian walking onion earned its name because it doesn't grow from seeds. Instead, it grows bulbils at the top of its green stalks. When those bulbs get heavy, they fall over and take root again. That's how it walks. Year after year, it spreads on its own, no work needed. Some historians trace it back to medieval monastery gardens in Central Europe, possibly as far back as the 11th century. Monks loved it for its independence. They didn't need to harvest bulbs every fall. It overwintered just fine. By the 1600s, these onions had migrated across farmyards in Germany, France, and northern Italy. Gardeners would find new clumps yards away from the original bed. That meant one planting could feed generations. Its flavor is sharp, almost garlicky. The greens can be snipped young like scallions. The underground bulbs store well. In some old folk texts, people claimed it repelled pests, and even spirits. Unlike modern onions that need yearly seeding and replanting, the Egyptian walking onion just keeps going. And it's drought-hardy, disease-resistant, and nearly bulletproof once it's established. But today, hardly any farms grow it. Commercial agriculture prefers uniformity, and this plant is too weird, too independent. It walked across centuries, yet got left behind when the seed catalogs modernized. And strangely, another ancient root crop once praised by Charlemagne followed a very similar path. Skirret before potatoes swept through Europe, Skirret fed kings. The Romans called it Caesar, and by 800 AD it was already spreading through Carolingian gardens. Charlemagne himself, yes, the Holy Roman Emperor, listed it in his Capitulare de Vilis, a royal farming decree ordering all his estates to grow it. So what was Skirret? A clump of thin white roots that tasted sweet, earthy, and almost peppery, like a mix between parsnip and carrot. Peel and roast it, and it caramelizes beautifully. Cookbooks from the 1400s praised it in pies and broth. In colder regions, it thrived where carrots struggled. But there's a twist. Skirret's root fork. Some are straight, others curl. Industrial farming couldn't automate the harvest, so it quietly vanished after the 18th century. Yet it lasts for years in a single spot. Divided every few seasons, and it keeps giving. Herbalists once believed it strengthened digestion and stirred the appetite. Medieval physicians even used it as a remedy for coughs and colds. Skirret doesn't need fertilizers or pesticides. It handles frost. And its stalks grow tall, with umbrella-like blooms that feed bees in midsummer. So why did a crop praised by emperors and monks vanish from our plates? Maybe because another royal crop took the spotlight, one blanched like asparagus, grown along the English coast, and nearly lost to sand. Sea kale. On the rocky shores of 17th century England, something surprising grew between the pebbles. Sea kale, or Cramba maritima, thrived where almost nothing else would. Hardy, salty, stubborn. It wasn't just edible, it was elegant. In fact, Victorian gardeners once covered its young shoots with clay pots to force them pale and tender like fancy white asparagus. But it started much earlier. By the mid-1500s, sea kale was already feeding coastal villagers from Cornwall to Kent. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy encouraged families to eat it as a cheap, vitamin-rich crop. Why? Scurvy. Its high vitamin C content helped fight it off. By 1800, it hit peak popularity. Fancy estates featured it in walled gardens. Queen Victoria reportedly had it served at banquets, but it didn't last. By 1900, it had nearly disappeared from markets. Too slow to grow, too wild-looking for urban grocers, yet one planting can last 10 years or more. It survives salt spray, clay, sand, and drought. Its thick roots burrow deep, and once it's happy, it stays. Blanched shoots in spring, cabbage-like leaves in summer, delicate white flowers in fall. So what pushed it out of kitchens? That answer lies in another vegetable, one bred for annual harvests, but once passed down through medieval kitchens like gold. Alpine strawberries once grew outside royal kitchens and peasant huts alike. Long before supermarket berries, Fragaria vesca filled medieval herb gardens with tiny, jewel-red fruit. These weren't the big, watery hybrids we know today. Each alpine berry was small, barely the size of a fingernail, but packed with wild, sweet flavor. Think soft perfume and tart honey, melting as soon as it touches your tongue. In 14th century France, monks cultivated them near abbey walls. In England, they became common after the Norman conquest. These strawberries didn't sprawl or rot fast. They stood upright, survived cold snaps, and came back every year. No replanting, no fuss. Records from 1600s, Germany called them God's fruit because they grew even in poor soil. Shakespeare even mentions wild strawberries in Henry IV, tucked into shady woods waiting to be found. But modern farming left them behind. Too soft to ship, too slow to grow, so factories favored larger hybrids bred in labs. Yet alpine strawberries still survive in hidden patches. Some gardeners claim they live over 5 years, fruiting twice a season. Birds ignore them, pests avoid them, and their roots weave deep, locking flavor in place. But what happens when a plant refuses to stay small, spreads underground, and bites back like fire? Horseradish. You plant it once, then it owns the land. Horseradish, Armoraceae rusticana, isn't just spicy, it's medieval tough. Once rooted, it spreads like a secret army underground. By the 13th century, monks in Central Europe used it to clear sinuses and stir blood. In Saxon England, it was mashed into meat sauces at feasts. The Saxons believed it gave strength. By 1470, apothecaries in Prague prescribed horseradish for lung disease, joint pain, even melancholy. Its volatile oils were so sharp they pierced wounds and burned away infection. That's probably why field surgeons carried it during the 30 Years' War. Cooks didn't stay away either. Across Germany and Poland, it became a winter root, sliced raw, mixed with cream, served with fish or game. By 1700, horseradish sauce showed up in English court kitchens. Some called it the poor man's pepper. But once it takes hold, good luck removing it. A single inch of leftover root will sprout again. That's why it's one of the few crops medieval gardeners planted outside the main beds, often behind barns or near fences where it wouldn't take over. And still, centuries later, horseradish remains one of the longest-living perennials. Fire in the ground, medicine on the plate. So what root crop once saved villages from starvation, but almost no one grows anymore? Perennial pea. In medieval Europe, the earthnut pea wasn't just a curiosity, it was a staple. Known then as Lathyrus tuberosus, this humble plant thrived in forest edges, meadows, and monastery gardens. What made it stand out was underground, not above. Small, edible tubers that tasted sweet and nutty, like a cross between a chestnut and a parsnip. Farmers didn't plant it for show. It fed people through winters and lean seasons, especially in poor soils where other crops failed. Once it's in the ground, it quietly comes back year after year without much help. No deep tilling, no reseeding, just harvest, eat, and wait for the next round. By the 1500s, earthnut pea had spread across Germany, France, and Eastern Europe. Peasants gathered it for stews and survival food. Even botanists praised its resilience. But over time, bigger, faster crops like potatoes and field peas took over. The earthnut pea disappeared from kitchen tables and slipped into the shadows of forgotten history. So why revive it now? Because this little tuber thrives without fertilizer. It fixes nitrogen into the soil, helping other crops grow. It survives drought. And in modern permaculture trials, it's showing promise for long-term, low-maintenance yields on depleted land. But one detail from its history still shocks researchers today. In a 1651 Bavarian famine record, the earthnut pea was the only food found growing wild in burned croplands after raids during the 30 Years' War. It saved entire villages. Most forgot what happened in monastic kitchens after the fall of Rome. But the next plant held one job: feed the body, season the soul. Perennial leek. Before seed catalogs, before supermarket hybrids, there was the perennial leek, Allium ampeloprosum var. Porum isn't just any leek. In medieval Europe, this was the kitchen's backbone. It grew quietly in cottage gardens, monastery beds, and farm borders across the continent. It never asked much, just dig, divide, replant, no seed needed. Year after year, it came back, ready to flavor pottage, stews, and healing broths. The Welsh prized it. In fact, by the 7th century, warriors in King Cadwallader's army wore leeks into battle to identify themselves. Leeks became so culturally rooted that by 1536 they were honored as a national emblem, still worn every March 1st on St. David's Day. But it wasn't just symbolic. This leek kept poor families alive during harsh winters. It stood tall when cabbages rotted or grains failed. A single clump could be divided endlessly, feeding generation after generation. By the 1800s, seed-based annual leeks took over. They were uniform, commercial, and easy to ship. But they lacked the resilience, flavor, and legacy of their perennial cousin. So why hasn't it made a comeback? Because most gardeners don't know it even exists. It fell through the cracks of time, quietly, like it always grew. And yet, in 2021, researchers in Cornwall found 200-year-old strains still growing beside a monastery ruin. But what if your broth needed something stronger than a leek, a plant with 6-foot stalks and the scent of forgotten medicine? It wasn't grown for beauty or size. This next plant was grown for survival, prayer, and power in a bowl. Lovage was the giant of medieval gardens, and for good reason. Levisticum officinale could grow up to 6 feet tall, return every spring without fail, and flavor a pot of soup with just a single leaf. Its name comes from love-ache, once believed to stir desire. But monks used it for something far more practical: food and medicine. Monastery kitchens across Europe prized love in broths and stews. Its celery-like taste with a deeper, richer note turned thin gruels into nourishing meals. In 820 A.D., Charlemagne ordered lovage, grown in his imperial gardens under the Capitulare Divilis, a list of essential plants for survival and healing. Lovage wasn't just for eating. Physicians crushed the seeds for colds, ground the roots for stomach aches and used the leaves to ward off infections. Travelers even wore it in their shoes to ease fatigue. By the 1600s, it had become a common herb for housewives and healers alike. So what wiped it out? Modern celery replaced it. Faster to grow, easier to market, and milder in taste. But celery had to be reseeded every season. Lovage could live over a decade in the same soil. Today, only a few heirloom growers keep it alive, quietly on the edges of Europe and Appalachian seed banks. Click the next video on your screen right now. Another story is waiting for you, buried just beneath the soil.